Into the Abyss.
Into the Abyss. Like, yeah, we're off to a great
The
start.
Chuck Tingle Appreciation Society.
Yeah, see, there you go. That's the intro. So we are live.
All right. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
So welcome to the first ever episode of Into the Abyss, and we're going to pretty much wing it here. And this is new territory for us. New, not just for this show, but new first time ever podcasting, video casting, whatever you want to call it. And we'll try to not screw it up royally.
In the basement.
Yes.
Coming live from the horror cave. That's right.
Kevin's Horror Cave. And you are?
I'm Kevin Lucia, for those of you guys that don't know me.
I'm Chuck. C.W. Breyer is my author name, but go by Chuck.
I'm Ted Hoost. My kids call me the Ted Man. Sometimes Dad.
And that's the dog.
And those are dogs.
And that's the dog.
And no, their name's not Cujo, but
Be a lot cooler if they were.
yeah. So why don't we talk a little bit about what it is we want to accomplish with this, what our aims are. Why don't you go first, and then we'll kind of bounce that back
I
and
guess
forth.
first one is to get settled in and try not to burp into the microphone as I'm drinking here. But
We may have had a few drinks already.
Yeah.
Not too many, but
so had moonshine.
we have had some moonshine, yes.
But anyway, the idea here is just to, I think this goes back to having been at some cons before and chatting there and just having fun with discussing horror, discussing books that we've enjoyed, movies, and honestly learning a lot from you, Kevin, with your experience, with your history with this, and drawing on that information. So for us, it's more about just bringing in that conversation into here and to discuss what we've been watching recently, what we've enjoyed, and share it. And I think one of the big ones is just to highlight what we've enjoyed so that other people will dive into the same thing or maybe get some new perspectives on those.
Right. Yeah, I've been reviewing probably for almost 12 years now, and one of the things I've learned with reviewing is there are personal preferences and then appreciating what the medium is trying to do. And I think I can speak for Chuck and I speak for myself. We're horror writers, but we're also horror fans. We don't really have any more authority than anybody else, but it's like Chuck said, when we're at conventions, we're talking about writing, but we're also talking about, hey, I saw this great movie, or like, even when we're hanging out, recently I went to Centralia, PA with fellow author Bob Ford, and we got to talking about this YouTube series that was really, really great. And I think that was kind of just our goal, was every month, look, this is what we've looked at in the horror world, this is what we saw in the theater, this is what I saw on Netflix, this is what I stumbled over on YouTube and really enjoyed it. And I think just really to have fun along the way in talking about the horror genre. And we may occasionally stray into like intellectual, analytical areas,
Or fake being intellectual.
Quasi-intellectual.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm an English teacher. That's what I do every single day. So it's kind of force of habit at this point. But I think at the same time, it's really like, hey, I really like this. I really enjoyed this. That sort of thing. So.
Okay. I think a good thing to cover is what kind of horror we enjoy, kind of our background on this, so that people know. You mentioned that it's subjective taste.
It is.
So I think it's a good thing to know up front what our preferences are, just so that people know what kind of filter to gauge our opinions.
Sure.
I'll go first.
Well, for me, there's kind of a preference for what I write and then a preference for what I enjoy. If you were to ever check out any of my fiction, all you got to do is type my name in Amazon and you'll find my books. I generally write what's known as quiet horror. It was coined. The phrase was coined by Charles L. Grant, which if you haven't read Charles L. Grant, you should fix that right now. So that's what I prefer to write. But really, when it comes to whatever I enjoy, so I'm going to be offering a top 5 streaming of the month, and here's basically my barometer. I engage with movies on 2 levels. One is purely in an entertainment level. Am I entertained? Was there a great atmosphere in this? Was there great acting? 2, not to get hoity-toity, but when I say am I engaged on an intellectual level, I don't mean that the movie has to be intellectual. But the longer I spend going, oh, what's going on here? Like, what's happening here? And the more I'm into the film. And whether that's a slasher film or whether that's a work of existential quiet horror, as long as it can do those 2 things, where it entertains me and then it intellectually engages me, then I'm good to go.
Okay. I would say for me, I come in from, with books, I do like stuff that's a little bit more literary, to be honest. I like good prose. So you'll often hear me times talk about authors I like who have beautiful prose. I like stuff that's more fun. I'm a big fan of monster stories. That's what I was. I grew up on with horror. A lot of my first loves in horror were monster films. So, monster ones, I would say, I'm not a gore first guy. I will point that out. I'm not opposed to gore. I actually like when it's earned, and I like that punch that's there. But if that's the first and main point of the story, it's probably not going to be my favorite story, to be honest. But if it's part of a greater story, I'm engaged with the characters. I'm having fun. I'm have something to think about. Then by all means, yeah, it's fine. I would say with movies, monster films, I love actually bad cinema. I love bad horror. It's a lot of fun.
So bad, it's good.
Yes, I grew up watching Mystery Science Theater 3000, or even without the commentary, just watching bad, old-fashioned sci-fi movies and stuff. Also, dark fantasy. Okay. I do, and that's what my usual writing is in. Short stories, typically horror, longer fiction, more dark fantasy. And I enjoy reading that as well. I like to have something that's got a little bit of bite to it.
Now, do me a favor, just out of curiosity, because this has always interested me, and this is also part of the show, is that we have a loose plan, and then whenever we feel like just going off on a tangent, we will. Define to me what do you consider dark fantasy? Because this is a term that fascinates me.
All right, I consider. Let me give you my I'm not an author. I'm just some chump who likes horror and fantasy. But Mark Lawrence, I consider Mark Lawrence like a dark.
Yep.
So like the Prince of Thorns.
Okay.
I mean, what are they? The Prince of Thorns, the Emperor of some crap, or was it all Thorns? I can't remember now. But he wrote the first three.
Thorns.
Well, and who was it about? It was about what was the character's name? The main character, because he was one of the awesome. His name was George, I think. George Ancraft was the main character, and like the whole storyline is he watched his mother and sister get murdered while he was trying to hide, or maybe he had been thrown into this pile of thorns and he couldn't move, so he lived and his whole family was slaughtered in front of him. So his whole goal through life is to just hurt other people, and so the whole story is told from his perspective, where he's a scumbag, but you understand why he's the way he is, and in the end he becomes like a likable, anti-hero who ends up being a hero. But that's dark, because everything in that, even the hero, is still raping and pillaging and doing terrible things. It's just he's the, what do you call it? I guess the imperfect vessel. Kind of deal, or whatever.
So that would be considered grimdark, and I would
that's
consider
grimdark. Yes, that's very dark.
I do definitely consider grimdark to be dark fantasy, but I also think it's more in a suspense level. I think the big thing with dark fantasy is it has to bring that sense of wonder that fantasy has. That has to be there in some balance with the horror. So the horror can come either, like the horror movies in general or horror books. Some of it comes in with suspense. Some of it comes in with more gritty content. I think it's the same thing. You have that sense of wonder of fantasy with the darker elements of horror of whatever.
So you're not saying it's dark in the sense that like Mark Lawrence is dark and just terrible and somber and sad. You're saying dark like spooky fantasy, like
it
horror
could be
fantasy.
It's both. I would say it's both.
A little
dark
bit of
fantasy is both. Now, when it gets to the point where it's more of a lighthearted story, and there's just that one evil monster. I mean, even Harry Potter has got some darker stuff. It's not really dark fantasy. It has to be focused on the tone, in my opinion. So for dark fantasy, it's got to go grimdark. It's got to go gritty, and that has to be the natural tone of the story, not a scene, but the normal tone of the story. Or the tone has to be something where it's focused on the suspense, more claustrophobic, more edge of your seat, compared to just it's a fantasy story with a monster.
The thing that interests me is not so much the dark, but the term fantasy. Because today the connotations is sword and sorcery, and the term was actually coined once again by Charles Grant, and the term fantasy was coined by him, not the fantasy genre, but the idea that it was fantastical. So, and this is kind of a generational thing, I think, because when I hear dark fantasy, I think of Charles Grant and his Ox Run Station novels. Something Wicked This Way Comes is a novel of the dark fantastic. You know what I mean?
And
so
I definitely, and I love
think,
that book.
I think it's just interesting. Like, I don't think either one is right or wrong. I just think it's an interesting generational difference that today, when people hear dark fantasy, they automatically assume the swords, the feudal, the Game of Thrones, but like 20 years ago. So it was just.
I think I
just,
do count as
it's
both,
just interesting.
and I would actually.
Yeah.
I mean, Something Wicked This Way Comes is definitely dark fantasy, and a
Yep.
lot of people would classify it as horror as well.
Yep.
The line between those two gets pretty well blurred,
Yep.
and so when it's hard to tell is this horror, is this dark fantasy, then
Yeah.
it quite possibly is both, and it fits in both.
Well, and the irony about that is that horror was never a separate genre. I mean, it didn't even have the World Horror Convention. I don't think didn't start until like the early '80s. Traditionally, horror was always a subgenre of fantasy because of the fantastical element. Before we had, horror started with gothic horror and things like that, and then of course you got stories like Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and The Invisible Man that kind of straddle between horror and sci-fi. But because they were fantastical for the longest time, before publishers started developing, marketing categories, horror was a subgenre of fantasy.
Speaking
So
of all the old school
it's
monsters,
interesting.
I just ate at Universal, and we went in and ate at like the Monster. I forget what it's called already, like the Monster Cafe or some crap like that.
Yep.
So I'm walking around a corner, and my son, who's 5, going to be 6 in December, is following me, and I'm kind of like out of the corner of my eye trying to keep an eye on him as we're walking around the corner, and I'm going back to the soda fountains. I see him stop in his tracks, just stops dead, looking up at the wall with big eyes, turns around, and just, if he was an adult, he would have dropped an F-bomb and said, F this, I'm out. And he just turned around and booked it. And he's going back to his mom around the corner. And I look up, and it was, I think it was like the swamp thing. And it wasn't even a real thing.
Yep.
It was just a picture on the wall, but he walked past it. He sees the swamp thing. He's like, nope, F this, I'm out. And he bolted.
Nope.
And then he didn't want to sit down. Then we had a hard time getting, because everywhere you look, it was the cheesy monster movies too. I'm talking old school Frankenstein,
Creature
the
from the Black
Mummy.
Lagoon.
Yeah, Creature from the Black Lagoon came up. Like all of the old classics, and he did not like any of them. And like the whole meal, he was just kind of looking around like, "What are you guys trying to do to me? Like I don't want
Yep.
I don't want to go on this."
And actually, you bring up the idea of and the definition of dark fantasy, but I would say also for horror we should mention as well what our definition is, because that's an even bigger argument in my opinion. I'm going to come to it, especially in this this video cast. The general term is just the idea that it's a story meant to disturb you at some level. That's the goal there. Whether it's more suspenseful, more gory, it's supposed to be hitting you somewhere that's uncomfortable,
Right.
and moving you in that way.
All right, so Anne Radcliffe, Gothic novelist, one of the first Gothic novelists, she has a really excellent essay that differentiates between terror and horror, and that I'm going to get it wrong, and somebody more knowledgeable than I is going to comment on this and correct me, and that's okay. But I believe that horror was an emotional response, and then terror was largely a visceral revulsion response.
Right.
And I think both of them are valid. And then Douglas Winter, Stephen King, book critic, Stephen King biographer, he's probably the contemporary version of that is, his statement that horror is an emotion.
Yep.
So when you apply that to stories, lots of things that aren't categorized as horror suddenly become
Yep.
horrific.
And actually, I just talked at a con with some people that were there about the types of horror and what you're aiming for in a story. And I did bring up Stephen King's definitions, which he expressed that this is not to be a clear definition. It's not supposed to be the clear boundaries and hard set. But the general idea he talked about was terror, horror, and revulsion. And in comparing the three, I described terror as usually aiming for the head, horror is aiming for the heart, and revulsion's aiming for the gut.
The gut. That's
And
right.
and so for another comparison, terror, you're trying to mess with the reader's imagination. Horror, you're probably revealing your imagination to them and what you can create. And then revulsion is usually not so much the imagination as it's more visceral. It's more visual.
I would almost say though, terror would be more like, if horror is the thing that's kind of going after your heart concept,
Yep.
isn't terror more going after like a more instinctual thing?
Yep.
Because I mean,
Yep.
if horror is
Right.
going to be the idea, I'd almost flip it, and I would almost say horror would be the mental part of it, because horror is playing on what you're thinking about, and it's the possibility of what could terrify you or scare you. But terror is being in the middle of it. And like, I was a big horror fan as a younger person, and then for some reason once I had kids, now I can't watch like the new horror. Like we were talking about it in the first episode. Well, the one that we didn't put out,
episode,
but practice. But like I can't watch like The Grudge anymore. I scream, and I'm going to disparage girls, but I scream like a 13, 12, 11-year-old girl. Now, like and that to me is terror. That's something I can't control as I'm sitting here watching this stupid movie, and I know that some weird old lady's about to show up with her jacked up face on the screen, but I will yelp and scream like an idiot, like one of those people in the movie theaters that goes crazy and says, "Don't open the door!" Like that's become me now, and horror doesn't do that to me. Horror, I don't have the same reaction to things that terrify me.
Horror is conceptual for you, and terror is
like I can handle something like what's Key and Peele guy there, Get Out. Is that even horror? Does that classify as horror?
Absolutely.
Yes. So see, I can do. I love those, and I can do those, and they don't scare me. They fascinate me the whole time. But you put me in front of The Grudge or The Ring, and that new style, like that Japanese, where we started to steal the good ideas from the Japanese, like that stuff just wrecks me. I can't do it anymore.
And I think that those terms, they often get interchanged, terror and horror, and it's really more of a vocabulary thing. But the basics ideas are there, which is you have the buildup, you have the suspense, you have messing with their heads. Then you have the moment of impact, where there's the actual cause of the fear, the thing that's been led to. And then there's the outcome of it. That's usually where the revulsion comes in, is now that the creature's got a hold of you, what does it do to you? And that's so there's all aspects of horror, and in the broad, loose definition of horror, it would include all of those elements.
And on a note on revulsion, revulsion, I think like anything else, and any genre has this, but revulsion can either appeal to the highest common denominator or the lowest common denominator. That sense of a transgression of boundaries, like you look at, like for example, Jeff Goldblum in The Fly. Like, I mean, when he becomes the Fly, it's not just gross. I think there's something instinctually we're like, there is something wrong with this.
Yes.
If you've read any books by Jack Ketchum or John Skip, now I am not, if I were to walk into a bookstore, I'm not heading to go find splatterpunk. That's not my preferred reading material. However, as a longtime reviewer, I recognize its storytelling power. And like everything else, there's good splatterpunk, and then there's the poor imitators that want to write a gross book. But like some of those novels that I read by Jack Ketchum, I was just sitting with the book, like cringing like this, but you can't look away. And it's not just merely gross. Like I kind of draw the line at. Like there's another writer who I've read a couple books by. His name's Ed Lee. Some of his books I liked. Some of his books were just kind of merely gross for me. But Jack Ketchum would just cross that line. He would just take you over so gently, and you're like, this is just the worst thing ever. But the revulsion worked not because they were aiming at a gross out reaction. They were really trying to get you that feeling of this is unnatural. This is not the way things should be.
Yeah, Drag Me to Hell was a good example of the revulsion where it was just stupid.
Yeah.
Because like you said, The Fly, you're grossed out. Like it's gross. It was inhuman.
Right.
It's something that, like you said, it's visceral. You feel something when you see that. Whereas Drag Me to Hell was just some girl puking gallons upon gallons of blood, like spraying it like a fireman's hose.
You mean like the end of Event Horizon?
It was terrible.
But I would say for me with the revulsion, as I hinted at before, it give me a reason to care. I'm perfectly fine when that's there. Put it in, have it as part of a story. I want to care about the character that's being hurt, and then there's that emotional impact that's there. If it's just a fireworks show of blood, it's not so much that I can't do it. It's just that it's dull.
Right.
I want to be engaged with the characters in the plot.
How about one of the most repulsive scenes to this day for me that I've ever seen in any movie is I think it's Seven. That's the end of Seven.
But that's a perfect example.
That is Revulsion. Yes. That plays on everything.
But
that's horrifying.
So well done.
So well done.
Yep.
So
well
and
done.
so that's a great example. That is just it hurts and it hits you hard. And the reason it hits you hard is because you are engaged with the characters. And in my opinion, you get more out of it. It's a bigger punch because you're engaged with the story, and it's not just look what we can create with gore.
And you're already at that point. You kind of feel it. Like it's one of those things where the lead up to what's in the box. What's in the box? Like the lead up to that, you knew what was in the box already, and the whole time you're just like, oh please, I hope that's not what's in the box. Like you were just like you were. I've never been more engaged, and I've never been more like repulsed by a scene in the movie.
And that was such a wonderful scene because I think I could be wrong. If I'm correct, I think the only thing you see when you open that box is maybe like a puff of hair. Like I think there's a strand of hair. You're like, oh, that's what's in the
It's
box.
his pregnant wife's.
Yeah.
I mean, spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Spoiler for a movie that's
20-year-old
20
You haven't
movie.
seen 7 yet. At this
Yeah,
point,
you're a
folks.
loser.